Sometimes a man reaches the end of his rope and finds there's nowhere left to fall. Tom Robinson knew that feeling well as he stood in the doorway of the old cabin, counting the last 4 silver dollars in his pocket. The locals called the place cursed. They said a family disappeared from here 40 years ago without a trace. But Tom didn't believe in curses. He'd lived through enough real pain to know the difference. All he wanted was a roof over his head and a place where his old dog scout could rest his bones. The cabin sat alone in Devil's Hollow, unwanted and forgotten. Perfect for a man who felt the same way about himself. Tom figured he and the broken-down place deserved each other. He had no idea that Scout would dig up something on their very first night that would change everything. What secret had been buried beneath that stone hearth for 4 decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through Devil's Hollow like a blade, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something that made Scout's ears flatten against his grizzled head. Tom Robinson pulled his worn coat tighter as he studied the cabin that would either be his salvation or his grave. At 60 years old, he'd run out of places to run and reasons to keep running. The structure before him had seen better decades. Logs that once stood proud and straight now sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters. The roof showed patches where previous owners had attempted repairs with whatever materials they could scavenge. Windows stared back at him like hollow eyes, their glass intact but clouded with age and neglect. Yet something about the place called to him. Maybe it was the way it seemed to hunker down against the elements, refusing to surrender despite everything working against it. Scout pressed close to Tom's leg. The old border collie's black and white coat now more gray than anything else. The dog had been with him for 8 years, ever since that terrible day when everything else in Tom's world had crumbled. Scout wore a leather collar so worn and soft it felt like cloth. A collar that had traveled thousands of miles across the frontier as they drifted from town to town, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. Tom knelt and ran his weathered hands through Scout's fur, feeling the familiar comfort of the only living thing that hadn't given up on him. "What do you think, old boy? Looks like our kind of place, doesn't it?" The dog whined softly, his brown eyes fixed on the cabin's stone chimney with an intensity that made Tom uneasy. Scout had always been sensitive to things others couldn't see or feel. On the trail, he'd warned of storms hours before the first clouds appeared, and he'd never failed to sense when trouble was coming. Right now, every line of the dog's body spoke of alertness bordering on alarm. "Easy there," Tom murmured. "Just an old cabin? Nothing here that can hurt us worse than what we've already survived." The journey to Devil's Hollow had taken 2 days of hard walking through mountain passes that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Tom's boots were worn thin, and his pack contained everything he owned in the world: a bedroll, a change of clothes, a hunting knife his father had given him 30 years ago, and a small leather pouch that held his most precious possession, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his son. Even now, 5 years after the accident, Tom couldn't think the boy's name without feeling like someone had reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart until he couldn't breathe. Michael had been 19, full of dreams about following his father into ranch work, about maybe starting a small spread of his own someday. He'd been helping Tom break horses for a wealthy rancher outside Denver when a spooked stallion had kicked him in the head. The boy had died 3 days later without ever waking up. Tom had blamed himself every day since. If he'd been faster, if he'd seen the horse's mood shift, if he'd sent Michael to work the gentler mares instead, 1,000 ifs that haunted his sleep and poisoned every sunrise. The grief had driven him from the ranch, from the town, from anyone who might remind him of what he'd lost. For 5 years he'd wandered like a ghost, working just long enough to buy supplies before moving on again. Now his wandering had brought him here, to this forgotten hollow where the town had been happy to sell him a worthless piece of property for the contents of his pocket. $4 for a cabin and 20 acres that nobody else wanted. The deed, such as it was, lay folded in his shirt pocket next to his heart. The local blacksmith who'd handled the transaction had been eager to complete the sale quickly, almost nervously. "You sure about this, mister? That place has been empty for 40 years. There's reasons for that." "What kind of reasons?" Tom had asked. The blacksmith had glanced around his shop as if afraid someone might overhear. "Morrison family used to live there. Good people, from what the old-timers say. Husband, wife, young boy, about 10 years old. One November they just weren't there anymore. Nobody ever found them. Nobody ever figured out what happened. Some folks say they packed up and left in the night, but their things were still there. Food on the table, clothes in the drawers, boys' toys scattered around. Like they just stepped outside for a minute and never came back." Tom had listened to this story with the weary patience of a man who'd heard too many tales designed to frighten strangers away from good land. Every frontier settlement had its ghost stories, its cursed locations, its convenient explanations for why prime property stayed empty. Usually it came down to money. Someone with more claim than deed, keeping others away until they could work the legal angles. But as he approached the cabin now, with Scout's unease growing stronger with each step, Tom began to understand why the blacksmith had been so nervous. The place felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with its physical condition. The air seemed thicker here, heavier, as if the hollow trapped more than just wind and weather. Even the wildlife seemed to avoid the area. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that made every footstep sound unnaturally loud. Tom pushed open the cabin door, half expecting it to fall off its hinges. Instead, it swung smoothly on leather hinges that someone had kept well-oiled, despite 4 decades of neglect. The interior made him pause. Dust covered everything like a shroud, but underneath he could see a home that had been loved and cared for. A wooden table still held 2 chairs pulled up to it, and a smaller chair, sized for a child, sat in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, still holding mason jars and crockery. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened with the remains of countless fires. Scout entered the cabin behind him, but immediately began to pace, his nails clicking against the wooden floor in an agitated rhythm. The dog's attention kept returning to the fireplace, and he made small whimpering sounds that Tom had never heard before. "What's got into you, boy?" Tom walked to the fireplace and examined the stone hearth. Someone had built it well, with carefully fitted rocks that showed the mark of a craftsman's hand. The stones were larger than they needed to be for structural purposes, forming a base that extended several feet into the room. Scout approached the hearth and began to sniff along its edges, his whines growing more urgent. The rest of the cabin showed signs of the Morrison family's sudden departure. In what must have been the parents' bedroom, Tom found a quilt still. Spread across a rope-frame bed, its colors faded but patterns still visible. A woman's dress hung from a peg on the wall, and a man's workshirt lay folded on a wooden chest. In the smaller room, the boys' room, toys lay scattered as if their owner had just stepped away from play. A wooden horse, its paint worn smooth by small hands. A set of marbles in a leather pouch. A book of children's stories, its pages yellowed but intact. Tom picked up the book and opened it to the first page. In careful script, someone had written, "For our dear Michael, on his 10th birthday. May these stories carry you to wonderful places. With love, Mother and Father." The name hit him like a physical blow. Michael, the same name as his son. Tom closed the book quickly and set it back where he'd found it. But the coincidence, if it was a coincidence, settled into his chest like a stone. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the hollow in shades of gold and red that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt ominous. Tom returned to the main room and began the practical work of making the place livable for the night. He swept dust from the table and chairs, checked the fireplace flue to make sure it would draw properly, and unrolled his bedding near the hearth where the warmth would reach him. Scout remained agitated throughout these preparations, occasionally approaching the stone hearth and sniffing intently before backing away with obvious reluctance. When Tom tried to call him over for supper, hardtack and jerky from his pack, the dog ignored him, something that had never happened in all their years together. "Come on, Scout. Whatever's bothering you, it can wait until morning." But Scout had no intention of waiting. As full darkness settled over Devil's Hollow and Tom built up the fire for the night, the old dog began to pace more frantically. He would approach the hearth, sniff along its base, then look at Tom with eyes that seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent and important. Tom had seen Scout behave this way only once before, when they'd been camping near a creek, and the dog had insisted on digging at a particular spot, despite Tom's efforts to stop him. Scout had eventually uncovered the bloated corpse of a deer that had died upstream and been buried by a flash flood. The water they'd been drinking was contaminated. Scout's persistence had probably saved both their lives. Now, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the cabin walls, Tom found himself studying the stone hearth with new attention. The stones were fitted together well, but not perfectly. Small gaps existed between some of them, and in the firelight he could see that the mortar around several stones had cracked and crumbled over the years. Scout approached the hearth again and began to paw at one particular stone, a flat piece of granite near the corner of the structure. His claws scraped against the rock with a sound that made Tom's teeth ache. "All right, boy, I get it. You want me to look at something." Tom knelt beside the hearth and examined the stone Scout had been focused on. Up close, he could see that the mortar around it was not just cracked, but completely loose. When he pressed on the stone, it shifted slightly. With a little effort, he was able to work it free from its position. Beneath the stone was a hollow space deliberately carved into the foundation, and within that space, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived 4 decades, was a rusted tin box about the size of a book. Scout stopped pacing and sat down, his tail wagging for the first time since they'd arrived. His brown eyes fixed on Tom with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally, you understand." Tom lifted the box from its hiding place with hands that trembled slightly. Whatever was inside, someone had thought it important enough to hide. Someone had taken the time to wrap it carefully and seal it away from moisture and time. Someone who might have been interrupted before they could retrieve it. The Morrison family. Tom set the box on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending tree branches scraping against the roof. The sound reminded him uncomfortably of fingers tapping, as if something outside was trying to get his attention. Scout padded over and placed his head on Tom's knee, no longer agitated but still alert. Together, they regarded the tin box that had waited 40 years for someone to find it. Tom thought about the vanished family, about the child named Michael who would never grow up to read the rest of his storybook. He thought about his own Michael, about chances missed and words unspoken, and the weight of carrying other people's secrets. Tomorrow, he decided, tomorrow he would open the box and see what the Morrison family had felt was worth hiding. Tonight, he was too tired to bear whatever new burden it might contain. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of a boy's. Laughter echoing through empty rooms, and Tom woke several times to find Scout standing alert by the window, ears pricked as if listening to voices only he could hear. Dawn came grey and reluctant to Devil's Hollow, filtered through clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Tom woke to find Scout already awake, sitting beside the table where the tin box waited like a silent accusation. The dog's brown eyes moved from the box to Tom's face with an expression that needed no translation. It was time. Tom's joints protested as he rose from his bedroll near the cold fireplace. The mountain air had settled into his bones overnight, reminding him that 60 years of hard living had left their mark. He rebuilt the fire more from habit than need. The cabin held warmth better than he'd expected, and put coffee on to boil in his battered tin pot. The box sat where he'd left it, its rusted surface catching the morning light that struggled through the dusty windows. In daylight, it looked less ominous and more pathetic, just an old container that had seen better decades. But Tom's hand still hesitated as he reached for it. "Nothing good ever came from opening other people's secrets," he said to Scout, who tilted his head as if considering this wisdom. "But then again, nothing good's come from leaving them alone either." The lid resisted at first, its hinges stiff with age and corrosion. When it finally gave way, with a protesting squeal, Tom found himself looking at a collection of items that someone had deemed precious enough to hide. 3 letters tied with a blue ribbon, a child's drawing folded carefully to fit the box's dimensions, a small leather journal, and what appeared to be a map sketched on paper that had yellowed with age. Tom lifted out the letters first. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, and the ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. The first letter was addressed to "My dearest Susan" in a man's careful handwriting. "The situation grows worse each day," it began. "Black Pete and his men came by again yesterday, demanding we sign over the mineral rights. I told them the same thing I've told them before. This land belongs to our family, and no amount of threats will change that. But Susan, I'm afraid. Not for myself, but for you and young Michael. These are not men who accept refusal gracefully." Tom's coffee boiled over, hissing in the fire, but he didn't notice. He was lost in words, written 40 years ago by a man named Morrison, who'd faced the same kind of trouble that seemed to follow decent people wherever they tried to make a home. The second letter was shorter and more urgent. "They came in the night again. Found their tracks around the cabin this morning. Michael asks why we keep the shutters closed, why he can't play outside alone anymore. How do you explain to a child that there are men in this world who would hurt a family for the sake of rocks in the ground? I've sent word to the territorial marshal, but God knows when he'll arrive. We may have to leave everything and run." The third letter was barely more than a scrawl, written in obvious haste. "They know about the silver. Don't know how, but they know. Moving the papers tonight. If something happens to us, look beneath the old oak by the creek. Tell the marshal about Black Pete Carver. Tell him we tried to do right." Scout whined softly, a sound that brought Tom back to the present. The dog was staring at the cabin door, ears erect and body tense. Outside, the wind had picked up, but underneath its howling, Tom thought he heard something else, a rhythmic creaking, like someone walking on loose floorboards. Tom set the letters aside and reached for his hunting knife, then caught himself. 40 years of mountain weather could make any old structure creak and settle. He was letting the dead man's fears get to him, but Scout's hackles were raised now, and the dog began to pace between Tom and the door, with the same protective stance he'd shown when coyotes had threatened their camp last winter. Tom unfolded the child's drawing, hoping to distract himself from Scout's agitation. The paper revealed a picture drawn in colored pencils, a child's interpretation of the cabin and surrounding area. But what made Tom's breath catch was not the innocent artistry, but what the young artist had chosen to include. Dark figures lurking behind trees, men with hats pulled low over their faces, and what appeared to be weapons in their hands. In the corner of the drawing, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "The bad men are watching us." The creaking sound came again, definitely from outside now, and definitely not caused by wind. Scout's whining grew more urgent, and he began scratching at the door, as if he wanted to go out and confront whatever was there. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered, but his own nerves were singing with tension now. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. The hollow looked empty, just wind-bent trees and morning shadows. But something about the scene felt wrong, as if the natural order had been disturbed. Then he saw it, fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the cabin's corner, prints that hadn't been there when he'd arrived yesterday. Tom's mouth went dry. Someone had been watching the cabin during the night, walking around it while he slept. Someone who'd been careful to stay quiet until now. He returned to the table and picked up the hand-drawn map. It showed the cabin and surrounding area in surprising detail, with various locations marked with symbols, an X by the creek, a circle around what appeared to be a cave opening, and a square near a formation of rocks. At the bottom of the map, In the same hasty handwriting as the third letter were the words, "All evidence hidden here." "Trust no one in town!" Scout's scratching at the door became more frantic, and his whines turned to low growls. Tom realized that whatever had been outside was now trying to get in. The door handle turned slowly, metal squeaking against metal. Tom grabbed his knife and backed toward the fireplace, pulling Scout with him. The door swung open with deliberate slowness, and a figure stepped into the cabin. It was a man in his 50s, wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with the careful gait of someone accustomed to walking quietly, and his hand rested on the butt of a pistol, holstered at his hip. "Morning," the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Tom couldn't place. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Saw smoke from your chimney and thought I'd pay my respects to the new neighbor." Tom kept his knife ready, but tried to appear calm. "Bit early for social calls, isn't it?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Early bird catches the worm, as they say. Name's Patterson. We do some surveying work for folks with interests in this area." "What kind of interests?" "Oh, you know how it is. Development opportunities, mineral assessments, that sort of thing." Patterson's gaze moved around the cabin, taking in the tin box and its scattered contents on the table. "Interesting reading material you've got there." Tom stepped sideways, blocking the stranger's view of the Morrison papers. "Private family documents. Nothing that would interest a surveyor. You'd be surprised what interests me, Mr. Robinson." "Tom Robinson. Well, Mr. Robinson, fact is, there's been some question about the legal status of this property. Previous claims, outstanding debts, that sort of thing. Might be best if you packed up and moved on before it gets complicated." Scout growled low in his throat, a sound that made Patterson's hand twitch toward his gun. The man's eyes fixed on the dog with unmistakable hostility. "Nice dog," Patterson said. "Be a shame if something happened to him." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Tom felt the familiar cold anger that had gotten him into trouble more than once over the years. But he also felt something else, a protective instinct that reminded him of how he'd felt about his son. "My dog and I aren't planning to go anywhere," Tom said quietly. "We just got here." Patterson's smile disappeared entirely. "That's unfortunate. This area can be dangerous for folks who don't understand the local customs. I'll keep that in mind." The stranger studied Tom for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Well then, Mr. Robinson, I reckon we'll be seeing each other again real soon." Patterson left as quietly as he'd come, but his boot prints joined the others in the soft earth outside. Tom waited until he was sure the man was gone before examining the tracks more carefully. At least 3 different sets of prints, all made by boots that were too new and too expensive for honest working men. Back inside, Tom gathered the Morrison papers and studied them again with fresh urgency. The family had faced the same kind of pressure he was facing now, men who wanted the land for reasons that had nothing to do with honest settlement, men who were willing to kill for it. The journal proved to be Morrison's record of escalating threats and encounters with Black Pete Carver's gang. The entries grew shorter and more desperate as the weeks passed, chronicling a family's growing terror as they realized no help was coming and nowhere was safe. The final entry was dated just 2 days before the family's disappearance. "They mean to kill us. I know it now. Tonight we hide everything that matters and pray someone will find it someday. If you're reading this, tell the world what happened here. Don't let them win." Tom closed the journal and looked at Scout, who had finally calmed down but remained alert. The dog's brown eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unsettled Tom, as if Scout understood more about their situation than any animal should. "Well, boy," Tom said softly, "looks like we've inherited more than just a cabin." Outside, storm clouds gathered overhead, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the windows. Tom realized that Patterson and his men would be back, probably in greater numbers. The Morrison family had run out of time and options. Tom was determined not to make the same mistake. He had survived 5 years of grief and wandering. He had nothing left to lose except his life and his dogs. But as he looked around the cabin that a loving family had been forced to abandon, as he held in his hands the evidence of their final, desperate hours. Tom Robinson felt something he hadn't experienced since his son's death. He felt responsible for something other than his own pain. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The rain that had threatened all morning finally arrived, with the force of mountain fury, drumming against the cabin roof and turning the world outside into a grey curtain of water. Tom was grateful for the storm. It would make it harder for Patterson and his men to watch the cabin, and the sound would cover any noise he made while examining the Morrison documents more thoroughly. He spread the child's drawing flat on the table, weighing down its corners with stones from the hearth. In the better light provided by several candles, details emerged that he'd missed in his first hasty examination. Young Michael Morrison had been more observant than most children his age. The dark figures lurking behind trees weren't just generic, bad men. They wore specific clothing, carried particular weapons, and one of them had a distinctive scar across his face that the boy had rendered with careful attention to detail. But what drew Tom's focus was something in the background of the drawing, a structure that didn't match anything he'd seen around the cabin. It appeared to be some kind of shed or lean-to, positioned near what the boy had drawn as a large rock formation. According to the map Morrison had sketched, that same rock formation was marked with a square symbol. Scout padded over and placed his chin on Tom's knee, seeking comfort from the storm's violence. The dog had been unusually clingy since Patterson's visit, never straying more than a few feet from Tom's side. Even now, his ears twitched at every sound that penetrated the rain's steady roar. "What do you think, boy?" Tom asked, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Should we trust a dead man's map, or are we borrowing trouble we don't need?" Scout's tail wagged once, a reserved endorsement that Tom interpreted as "proceed with caution." Tom reread Morrison's journal entries, this time paying attention to dates and details he'd overlooked in his initial shock. The family had discovered something on their property in late September. Morrison referred to it cryptically as the Lord's gift to honest folk. Within 2 weeks, Black Pete Carver had appeared with his first demands. The timing couldn't be coincidental. A particularly loud crack of thunder made both Tom and Scout jump. But as the sound faded, Tom realized it hadn't been thunder at all. Something large had fallen outside, possibly a tree branch or even a whole tree. The storm was getting worse. He was considering whether to venture outside to secure anything that might blow away when Scout suddenly went rigid, his head cocked as if listening to something Tom couldn't hear. The dog's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and his hackles rose along his spine. "What is it, boy?" Scout moved to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. His growl, when it came, was so low Tom felt it more than heard it. Something was outside, moving despite the storm. Tom blew out the candles and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. Lightning illuminated the hollow in stark black and white snapshots. But he saw nothing unusual, just wind-lashed trees and sheets of rain. Then another lightning flash revealed a figure standing motionless near the tree line, apparently unbothered by the downpour. The figure was too distant, and the light too brief for Tom to make out details. But someone was definitely watching the cabin. Scout's growling intensified, and he began to pace between the door and the window, torn between wanting to confront the intruder and protecting Tom. The dog's distress was contagious. Tom found his own heart racing as he tried to keep track of the figure through the storm. When the next lightning flash came, the figure was gone. Tom waited for several minutes, watching for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. Either the watcher had withdrawn or had found better concealment. Neither possibility was comforting. He relit one candle and returned to the table, but concentration was impossible now. Every sound from outside, and the storm provided many, could be someone approaching the cabin. Tom found himself checking and rechecking the loads in his old single-shot rifle, the only firearm he possessed. It was then that Scout did something Tom had never seen before. The dog approached the child's drawing and began sniffing it intently, his nose barely touching the paper. When he reached the portion that showed the rock formation and hidden structure, Scout whined and looked at Tom with unmistakable urgency. "You think we should go there? In this weather?" Scout's response was to pad to the door and scratch at it once, then return to the drawing and touch his nose to the same spot again. Tom studied the map more carefully. If Morrison's drawing was accurate, the rock formation was less than half a mile from the cabin, following what appeared to be an old game trail. The square symbol could mark the location where Morrison had hidden everything that matters, possibly including evidence of what Black Pete Carver had been after. The smart thing to do was wait for better weather. The smart thing was to avoid wandering around unfamiliar terrain in a storm while hostile men might be watching. But Tom had spent 5 years being smart, keeping his head down, avoiding trouble and responsibility. Look where it had gotten him. He gathered the Morrison papers and returned them to the tin box, then wrapped the whole thing in oiled cloth from his pack. If Patterson and his men decided to search the cabin while he was gone, they'd find nothing useful. "All right, Scout, but if we get struck by lightning, I'm blaming you." Tom pulled on his heaviest coat and made sure his knife was secure at his belt. The rifle he left behind, it would be useless in the rain, and carrying it would only slow him down. Scout danced with excitement as Tom prepared to leave, the dog's fear apparently overcome by the prospect of action. The storm hit them like a physical blow as soon as they stepped outside. Rain drove horizontally across the hollow, and the wind was strong enough to stagger a man if he wasn't careful. Tom pulled his hat down tight and followed Scout toward the tree line. The dog seemed to know exactly where he was going, following a path that was invisible to Tom, but apparently clear to Scout's superior senses. They climbed steadily through pine forest that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. But the rain found its way through even the thickest canopy. After 20 minutes of difficult hiking, Scout stopped and looked back at Tom expectantly. They had reached a clearing dominated by a formation of granite boulders that matched the child's drawing perfectly. And there, tucked between 2 of the larger rocks, and almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was a crude shelter made from pine logs and stone. Tom approached the structure cautiously. It was clearly old, but had been built to last. Someone had taken considerable care with its construction. The entrance was low, barely high enough for a man to enter without stooping, and partially concealed by a carefully arranged pile of deadfall. Scout showed no hesitation. He squeezed through the entrance and disappeared into the shelter's interior. Tom heard the dog moving around inside, then a sharp bark that seemed to say, "Come see this." Tom pushed aside the deadfall and crawled through the entrance. The shelter was larger inside than it appeared from outside, with a ceiling high enough for him to stand upright in the center. Someone had hollowed out the space between the boulders and reinforced it with timber and stonework, but what made Tom's breath catch was what the shelter contained. Wooden crates stacked along one wall, covered with canvas tarps that had somehow survived 40 years of weather. Scout was standing beside the crates, tail wagging, looking pleased with himself. Tom lifted one of the tarps and found himself staring at carefully packed mining equipment. Picks, shovels, pans, and other tools needed to extract precious metals from rock and earth. But more importantly, he found surveyor's instruments. Sample bags filled with ore and a leather satchel containing official-looking documents. The Morrison family hadn't just discovered something valuable on their land. They'd been actively mining it, and Black Pete Carver had killed them for it. Tom's hands trembled as he opened the leather satchel, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to discover. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents that would have made any man's fortune, and apparently had cost the Morrison family their lives. The first document was an official territorial survey map, stamped and signed by government surveyors. It showed a significant silver vein running directly beneath the Morrison property, with estimated yields that made Tom whistle low under his breath. No wonder Black Pete Carver had been willing to kill for this land, but it was the second document that made his blood run cold. It was a blood-stained map, hand-drawn on paper that had been folded and refolded many times. The brown stains weren't rust or dirt. They were clearly blood, dried and darkened with age. Someone had drawn this map while wounded, perhaps dying, marking specific locations with shaking hands. Scout whined and pressed against Tom's leg, sensing his distress. The dog's warmth was comforting in the damp chill of the stone shelter. But nothing could ease the growing certainty that Tom was holding the Morrison family's final testimony. The blood-marked map showed the cabin and surrounding area in detail, but it included features that didn't appear on Morrison's earlier sketch. Cave openings were marked with crude symbols, and paths were traced between various landmarks. Most disturbing of all, 3 locations were marked with crosses, the universal symbol for graves. Tom studied the map by the dim light filtering through the shelter's entrance. One of the marked grave sites was less than 100 yards from where he sat. Another was near the creek that ran through the property. The third was behind the cabin, in a grove of aspen trees he'd noticed but not explored. "They're still here," he whispered to Scout. "The Morrison family is still here." The dog's ears flattened against his head, and he moved to the shelter entrance as if wanting to leave. But Tom wasn't finished exploring the hidden cache. More wooden crates lined the walls, and each one might contain evidence of what had really happened 40 years ago. The second crate held clothing, a man's work shirt, a woman's dress and a child's jacket, all carefully folded and preserved. But underneath the clothing, Tom found something that made his heart pound. A small wooden box containing personal items. A woman's wedding ring, a man's pocket watch, and a child's set of marbles. The same marbles Tom had seen scattered in the cabin. These weren't just belongings left behind in haste. These were treasures gathered by someone who knew they might die. Someone who wanted to preserve what mattered most for whoever might find them later. The third crate contained what appeared to be Morrison's complete mining records. Sample bags filled with ore were labeled with dates and locations. A leather-bound ledger recorded yields and estimated values. Maps showed the extent of the silver vein and the best places to dig. Morrison had been conducting a professional mining operation, not just panning for gold in the creek. But the final crate held the most important discovery of all. Weapons. Not the tools of miners or farmers, but the arsenal of men preparing for war. Rifles, ammunition, and even a few sticks of dynamite, carefully wrapped and stored. Morrison had known that Black Pete Carver would eventually come for him with violence, and he'd tried to prepare. It hadn't been enough. Scout's whining grew more urgent, and he began pawing at Tom's leg. The dog was clearly agitated about something, and his instincts had proven reliable so far. Tom quickly gathered the most important documents, the survey map, the blood-stained map, and Morrison's mining ledger, and wrapped them in oiled cloth. As they prepared to leave the shelter, Scout suddenly froze, his entire body going rigid. His ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Someone was approaching through the forest. Tom extinguished the small lantern he'd been using and pressed himself against the shelter's stone wall. Through the entrance, he could hear voices carried on the wind, at least 2 men, possibly more, calling to each other as they searched the area. "Check those rocks again," one voice commanded. "Morrison's family didn't just disappear. They hid something, and it's got to be around here somewhere. Been looking for 40 years, another voice replied. "Maybe it ain't here to find." "It's here," the first voice said with absolute certainty. "My grandfather saw Morrison coming up this way the night before they disappeared. Whatever they hid, it's in these rocks somewhere." Tom's blood chilled as he realized who was searching for the shelter. These weren't just any treasure hunters. They were descendants of Black Pete Carver, still looking for what their ancestor had killed for. Scout pressed against Tom's leg, trembling with the effort of staying quiet. The dog's instincts screamed at him to protect Tom, but his training kept him silent and still. The voices grew closer, and Tom could hear boots scraping against stone as the searchers examined the rock formation. They were being thorough, checking every crevice and shadow. It was only a matter of time before they found the shelter's concealed entrance. "What about this pile of deadfall?" one of them asked. "Just old branches." Storm probably blew them here. Tom held his breath as footsteps approached the very spot where he and Scout were hidden. Through a gap in the deadfall, he could see a man's legs not 3 feet away. The searcher was examining the entrance area, looking for signs of disturbance. Scout's body went tense as a bowstring. The dog's eyes fixed on the gap where the man's legs were visible, and Tom could feel the animal's barely controlled desire to attack. Scout had always been protective, but this was different. This was the focused intensity of a predator defending his pack. Nothing here, the searcher finally decided. Let's check the creek area. The voices and footsteps gradually faded as the men moved away from the rock formation. Tom waited for several minutes before allowing himself to breathe normally again. When he was certain they were gone, he whispered to Scout, "Good boy, you saved us both." But as they prepared to leave the shelter, Tom realized their situation had become much more dangerous. Patterson and his men weren't just interested in running him off the property. They were actively searching for Morrison's hidden evidence. They knew about the silver, and they knew the family had hidden proof of their mining operation. The storm had passed while they were in the shelter, leaving the forest dripping and quiet. Tom followed Scout back toward the cabin, but his mind was racing with new understanding. The Morrison family hadn't just been murdered for their land. They'd been tortured for information about where they'd hidden their evidence. And now Tom possessed that evidence. As they approached the cabin, Scout suddenly stopped and raised his head, sniffing the air. His hackles rose slowly, and he looked toward the cabin with obvious alarm. Tom followed the dog's gaze and felt his heart sink. Smoke was rising from the cabin's chimney, smoke from a fire he hadn't left burning. Someone was inside, waiting for them to return. Tom approached the cabin with the caution of a man who'd learned to read danger in small signs. The smoke rising from his chimney was too steady, too controlled to be the result of banked coals rekindling themselves. Someone had deliberately built up the fire, and that someone was either supremely confident or supremely stupid. Scout stayed close to Tom's heel, moving with the silent precision of a hunting dog. The border collie's training from their years on various ranches had taught him to work quietly when needed, and he seemed to understand that stealth was now a matter of survival. They circled the cabin at a distance, using the tree line for cover. Tom counted 2 horses tied behind the structure. Good horses, well-fed and well-cared for, the kind that cost serious money. These weren't drifters or common claim jumpers. These were men with resources and backing. Through the cabin's single window, Tom could see the flickering light of his own fire and the shadows of at least 2 figures moving inside. They appeared to be searching the place thoroughly, examining everything he'd left behind. Fortunately, the most important discoveries were wrapped in oiled cloth inside his coat. Scout touched his nose to Tom's hand and looked toward the back of the cabin, where a small shed stood near the tree line. Tom understood immediately. The dog was suggesting they take shelter there and wait for the intruders to leave. It was sound, tactical thinking that reminded Tom of how Scout had always seemed to possess an almost human intelligence. They made their way to the shed without being detected. The small structure was filled with tools and supplies left by previous occupants, rusty saws, broken harnesses, and other debris of frontier life. But it provided concealment and a clear view of the cabin's rear door. Tom settled down to wait, but Scout remained alert, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds that Tom couldn't hear. The dog's supernatural senses had proven invaluable, and Tom had learned to trust them completely. After 20 minutes, the cabin door opened, and 2 men emerged. Even in the fading afternoon light, Tom could see they were cut from the same cloth as Patterson, well-dressed, well-armed, and carrying themselves with the confidence of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. The taller of the 2 was speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the yard. Nothing useful inside. Just the usual drifter's gear. Patterson said the old man found something, the shorter man replied. Morrison family's been dead 40 years, but they hid their secrets somewhere. Maybe the old fool was just lucky when he bought this place. Maybe he doesn't know anything about what's buried here. Grandfather Pete didn't think so. He always said Morrison told him where the silver was before he died. Problem was, Pete never had time to dig it up before the law came sniffing around. Tom's blood ran cold as he realized he was listening to the descendants of Black Pete. Carver, men who'd inherited both their ancestors, greed and his willingness to kill for it. The casual way they discussed Morrison's murder made it clear they viewed violence as just another business tool. The shorter man lit a cigarette and looked around the hollow with obvious frustration. 40 years we've been looking. 40 years of checking every new owner, every drifter who thought he could make a home here. Got to be something we're missing. Maybe it's time to try a different approach, the taller man suggested. Instead of scaring people off, maybe we should let them look for us. Offer a partnership. You want to trust some broken-down mountain man with our family business? I want to use him. Let him do the dangerous work of searching, then take whatever he finds. If he gets unlucky in the process... The man shrugged, letting the threat hang unfinished. Scout's growl was so low, Tom felt it more than heard it. The dog's hatred for these men was almost palpable, and Tom had to place a restraining hand on the animal's neck to keep him from charging out of the shed. The men continued their conversation as they untied their horses, discussing plans that made Tom's situation increasingly clear. They intended to watch him, let him search for Morrison's evidence, then kill him for it. The same strategy their ancestor had used on the original family. What about the dog? The shorter man asked. Patterson said it was acting strange, like it knew something. Dogs don't know anything. They just react to what they smell or hear, probably picking up scents from the old graves. You think the bodies are still around here somewhere? Pete buried them deep, but 40 years of weather and animals. Who knows? Point is, the dog's not a threat. It's just an animal. Tom felt Scout's muscles tense beneath his hand. The dog's intelligence was far beyond what these men imagined, and their dismissal of him as just an animal was a mistake that might prove useful later. The men mounted their horses and rode away, but their parting words chilled Tom to the bone. We'll be back tomorrow. Time to have a real conversation with Mr. Robinson about his future on this property. Tom waited until he was certain they were gone before emerging from the shed. Scout immediately led him to the spot where the horses had been tied, sniffing the ground with intense concentration. The dog's investigation was methodical and thorough, as if he was memorizing the scents of their enemies. Back inside the cabin, Tom discovered that the search had been more intrusive than he'd first realized. His few possessions had been examined and replaced with deliberate carelessness, a message that his privacy no longer existed. Even his bedroll had been unfolded and searched, but the most disturbing discovery was what they'd left behind. A family Bible, old and worn, placed prominently on the table where he couldn't miss it. Tom opened it with trembling hands and found himself looking at the Morrison family records. Birth dates, marriage certificates, and family trees were recorded in careful handwriting. But pressed between the pages were dried flowers, personal mementos, and photographs that brought the vanished family to life. Here was Morrison himself, a strong man with kind eyes and calloused hands. His wife Susan, beautiful and dignified, holding their young son Michael. The boy looked exactly like Tom's own son had at that age. Tom sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of coincidence and connection. Two families, 40 years apart, both destroyed by the same evil. Two boys named Michael, both innocent victims of adult greed and violence, but it was the final discovery that broke Tom's heart completely. Tucked into the back of the Bible was a letter addressed to whoever finds this. It was written in a woman's hand, Susan Morrison's final words to the world. If you are reading this, then we are gone and our killers have won. But please know that we died trying to protect something precious, not the silver in the ground, but the idea that good people should be able to make a home in peace. Our boy Michael wanted to be a rancher when he grew up, to raise horses and cattle in this beautiful valley. Now he'll never have that chance. We pray that someday someone will come who is strong enough to stand against the evil that has claimed this place. Someone who will honor our memory by living the peaceful life we were not allowed to have. If you are that person, then our deaths will not have been meaningless. Please remember us with kindness, and if you can, say a prayer for our souls. We go to our rest, knowing we fought for what was right, even though we could not win." Tom closed the Bible and looked at Scout, who was watching him with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. The dog's expression was one of perfect understanding. He knew they had reached the point where running was no longer an option. The Morrison family had been murdered for trying to live peacefully on their own land. Tom's own son had died because of another man's greed and carelessness. Now the descendants of Black Pete Carver were planning to add Tom and Scout to their list of victims. But this time, the outcome would be different. This time, they would face a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. That night, Tom did not sleep. Instead, he sat by the dying fire with the Morrison family Bible open in his lap, reading the mining survey papers by candlelight and planning his next move. Scout lay beside him, alert but calm, as if the dog understood they had crossed some invisible line from victim to participant. The mining survey documents revealed more than just the location of silver deposits. They showed the full extent of Morrison's operation, a network of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the area beneath Devil's Hollow. Morrison had been methodical in his work, mapping every vein and documenting every find with the precision of a man who understood the value of what he'd discovered. But more importantly, the documents showed Morrison's growing awareness that he was being watched. Notes in the margins recorded suspicious activity. Strangers asking questions in town, men seen observing the property from a distance, tools that had been moved when no one should have been on the land. Morrison had known Black Pete Carver was coming for him, and he'd prepared accordingly. Tom spread the blood-stained map on the table beside the survey documents, comparing the two. The official survey showed the mineral deposits, but the blood-marked map showed something else entirely, a defensive network of caves, hidden positions, and escape routes that Morrison had planned to use against his enemies. The Morrison family hadn't just been victims waiting for slaughter. They'd been preparing for war. Scout raised his head and looked toward the door, ears pricked with attention. Tom heard it too, the soft creak of a footstep on the cabin's front porch. But instead of alarm, he felt a strange calm settle over him. "Let them come." This time he was ready. The footstep came again, followed by a gentle knock on the door. This wasn't the aggressive entrance Patterson had made the day before. Someone was announcing their presence, asking permission to enter. "Mr. Robinson?" The voice was elderly, carefully polite. "Might I have a word with you?" Tom checked his rifle and moved to the window. In the moonlight, he could see a single figure on the porch. An old man leaning heavily on a walking stick, apparently alone and unarmed. But after the day's revelations, Tom trusted nothing at face value. "State your business," he called through the door. "My name is Crawford Whitley. I knew the Morrison family. I've been waiting 40 years for someone like you to come along." Tom studied the figure more carefully. The man was genuinely old, probably in his 70s, and his posture suggested infirmity rather than threat. But his presence here at night after everything that had happened was suspicious. "How do I know you're not working with the others?" "Because, Mr. Robinson, if I was working with the Carver family, you'd already be dead." The simple honesty of the statement carried conviction. Tom opened the door but kept his rifle ready. In the moonlight, he could see that Crawford Whitley was indeed an elderly man, thin and frail, with white hair and deeply lined features. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and they held a sadness that Tom recognized. "Come in," Tom said, "but keep your hands where I can see them." Whitley entered slowly, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Scout approached the old man cautiously, sniffing carefully before settling back on his haunches. The dog's acceptance was more convincing than any words could have been. "Thank you," Whitley said, settling into one of the chairs at the table. "I'm too old for midnight meetings, but some conversations can't wait for daylight. You said you knew the Morrisons." "I was 10 years old when they disappeared," Whitley replied. "Young Michael Morrison was my best friend." Tom felt the familiar twist in his chest at the mention of the boy's name. You were here when it happened. I was supposed to be here. Michael had invited me to spend the night. We were going to help his father check the mining equipment the next morning. But my mother took sick that evening, and I couldn't come. Whitley's voice carried the weight of 40 years of survivor's guilt. Tom understood that burden all too well. The next day, when Michael didn't come to town as planned, my father and I rode out to check on them. Found the cabin just like you found it, everything in place, but the family gone. No signs of struggle, no indication of where they'd gone or why. But you knew, didn't you? The old man nodded slowly. Black Pete Carver had been pressuring them for weeks. Everyone in town knew it, but nobody wanted to get involved. Pete and his men were dangerous. People who crossed them had a way of disappearing. Tom poured coffee from the pot he'd kept warm by the fire and offered it to Whitley. The old man accepted it gratefully, wrapping his gnarled hands around the cup for warmth. After the Morrisons disappeared, Pete tried to file a claim on this property. Said they'd abandoned it, owed him money, various legal pretenses. But the territorial marshal was suspicious. Started asking questions, investigating Pete's business dealings. What happened to Pete? Found dead in a mining accident 6 months later. Gave in, they said, though some folks wondered if it was really an accident. Whitley sipped his coffee thoughtfully. His sons inherited his interests. They've been looking for Morrison's evidence ever since. Tom gestured to the documents spread on the table. Evidence like this? Whitley's eyes widened as he saw the mining surveys and Morrison's maps. Dear God, you found them. After all these years, you actually found Morrison's records in a hidden shelter up in the rocks, along with mining equipment and personal belongings. And weapons? Yes, Morrison was preparing to fight. Whitley was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with tears in his eyes. He was a good man, John Morrison. Worked hard, treated everyone fairly, loved his family. He didn't deserve what happened to him. None of them did, Tom said quietly. Especially not the boy. Michael was going to be a rancher, Whitley said, echoing the words from Susan Morrison's letter. Used to draw pictures of the cattle he was going to raise, the horses he wanted to train. Had it all planned out. Scout moved closer to the old man, as if sensing his grief. Whitley reached down to scratch the dog's ears, and Tom saw tears running down the weathered cheeks. I've spent 40 years wishing I'd been here that night, Whitley continued, wondering if I could have made a difference, if I could have helped them somehow. You were 10 years old, Tom pointed out. There was nothing you could have done. Maybe, but I've never stopped feeling responsible, never stopped looking for a way to make it right. Tom studied the old man's face, seeing in it the same mixture of grief and determination that he felt in his own heart. Is that why you're here? To make it right? The Carver family has controlled this area for 40 years through fear and violence. They've driven off or killed anyone who got too close to the truth. But you're different, aren't you, Mr. Robinson? You're not planning to run. Tom looked at Scout, who was watching the conversation with obvious interest. The dog seemed to approve of Crawford Whitley, and Tom had learned to trust Scout's judgment about people. No, Tom said finally. I'm not planning to run. Whitley smiled for the first time since entering the cabin. Then perhaps it's time to finish what John Morrison started. Dawn brought Crawford Whitley's most startling revelation yet. The old man had slept fitfully in Morrison's chair by the fireplace, and when Tom woke, he found Whitley already awake, staring at something he held in his weathered hands. There's something I didn't tell you last night, Whitley said without preamble. Something I've kept secret for 40 years, because I was afraid if anyone knew, the Carvers would finish what they started. Tom poured coffee and waited. Scout, who had claimed a position equidistant between both men, watched Whitley with the same intense attention he'd shown before every important discovery. My name isn't Crawford Whitley, the old man continued. It's Michael Morrison. The coffee cup slipped from Tom's fingers, shattering against the cabin floor. Scout jumped at the noise, but didn't take his eyes off the old man, who claimed to be someone who should have died 40 years ago. That's impossible, Tom said. The Morrison boy disappeared with his family. I said I was supposed to be here that night, the old man interrupted. I was. I lied about my mother being sick. The truth is, I was here when Black Pete Carver and his men came for my family. Tom's mind reeled as he tried to process this revelation. The elderly man he'd thought was a neighbor, a friend of the family, was actually the Morrison boy, the child whose drawings Tom had found, whose toys still lay scattered in the back room. I don't understand. If you were here, why didn't they kill you too? Michael Morrison, for that's who he truly was, held up the object he'd been clutching. It was a carved stone, roughly the size of a man's fist, with symbols etched into its surface that looked like crude writing. Because my father was smarter than any of us realized, Michael said. He'd been preparing for this night for weeks. When we heard the horses coming, he didn't try to run or fight. He sent me through a tunnel. What tunnel? My father had been mining these hills for 2 years. He'd found more than just silver. He'd discovered a whole network of natural caves that connected to the mine shafts. Some of them reached clear to the other side of the mountain. Michael's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if finally telling the truth after decades of deception was lifting a great weight from his shoulders. That night, when we heard Black Pete's men approaching, Father opened a hidden entrance in the cabin floor. There was a tunnel that led directly to the main cave system. He told me to run, to get as far away as possible, and not to come back no matter what I heard. Tom felt sick as he imagined a 10-year-old boy crawling through dark tunnels while his parents were murdered above. But you didn't go far. I went far enough to be safe, but not far enough to avoid hearing. Michael's voice broke. I heard my mother screaming. I heard Pete Carver demanding to know where Father had hidden the mining records. I heard my father refuse to tell them, even when they... The old man couldn't finish the sentence, but Tom understood. John Morrison had died protecting the evidence that would prove Carver's guilt, and he died knowing his son might survive to seek justice someday. The tunnel system is extensive, Michael continued, visibly pulling himself together. Father had mapped most of it, and I spent the next 3 years living in those caves, surviving on what I could hunt and gather. I was 14 when I finally came out, claiming to be an orphan from back east looking for work, and no one recognized you. I'd grown 6 inches and 40 pounds. Malnutrition and living in caves had changed me physically. More importantly, everyone believed Michael Morrison was dead. People see what they expect to see. Tom picked up the carved stone that Michael had been holding. The symbols were clearly deliberate, carved with care and precision. What is this? The key to everything Father hid. He carved it during his last week, when he knew the end was coming. It's a map, Mr. Robinson, but not to the silver deposits. It's a map to where he buried Black Pete Carver's confession. Confession? Michael's eyes glittered with 40 years of suppressed anger. Father was smarter than Pete gave him credit for. When Pete first started pressuring us, Father began documenting everything, dates, witnesses, threats. But more than that, he started investigating Pete's background. Michael pointed to specific symbols on the stone. Pete Carver wasn't just a claim jumper. He was a wanted man, running from murder charges in 3 territories. Father found proof, wanted posters, witness statements, evidence that Pete had killed at least 12 people before he came here. Tom turned the stone over in his hands, beginning to understand its significance. Your father was building a case against him. More than that. Father confronted Pete with the evidence, thinking he could force him to leave us alone. Instead, Pete confessed everything, bragged about it, actually. He was proud of the people he'd killed, the families he'd destroyed, and your father recorded the confession. Every word. Not just about his past crimes, but about his plans for our family. Pete told Father exactly what he intended to do to us, and Father wrote it all down. Then he hid it where Pete would never think to look. Tom studied the carved symbols more carefully. They weren't random. They formed a clear pattern that reminded him of the survey maps he'd found. This shows the location? Father carved this stone the night before Pete came for us. He gave it to me as I was going into the tunnel, told me it was the most important thing I would ever carry. He said, if anything happened to him and Mother, I should find someone I trusted completely and show them this stone. And in 40 years, you've never trusted anyone enough? Michael's laugh was bitter. How could I? The Carver family has had spies and allies in every settlement, every territorial office, every law enforcement agency. Anyone I trusted might betray me to them. But you're different, Mr. Robinson. How do you know? Because you stayed. Because you found the evidence in the rocks, and instead of running or selling it to the highest bidder, you kept looking for the truth. Because you have the same kind of grief in your eyes that I've carried for 40 years. Tom set the stone on the table beside Morrison's other documents. The pieces were finally falling into place, not just the mystery of the Morrison family's disappearance, but the larger pattern of corruption and violence that had controlled this area for decades. Where did your father hide the confession? In the one place Pete Carver would never desecrate, no matter how desperate he became. Michael pointed toward the window, toward the grove of aspen trees behind the cabin. Father buried Pete's confession with our family. Tom's blood ran cold as he understood. Your parents' graves. Father knew that even a man like Pete Carver wouldn't dig up graves looking for evidence. It would be too risky. Too many witnesses, too many questions if anyone saw disturbed burial sites. So he hid the confession in my mother's coffin. Scout whined softly and moved to the window, looking out toward the aspen grove as if he understood the conversation and was troubled by its implications. The confession is still there? Tom asked. As far as I know. Pete died 6 months after killing my parents, and his sons never figured out where Father hid the evidence. They've been searching for 40 years, but they've been looking in all the wrong places. Tom stood and walked to the window, studying the grove of trees where the Morrison family lay buried. Somewhere beneath that peaceful ground lay the evidence that could finally bring justice for their murders. If we dig it up, we can prove what really happened here. More than that, Michael said. We can prove that the Carver family has been living on blood money for 40 years. We can prove that every claim they've filed, every property they've acquired, every business they've built is based on murder and theft. Tom turned back to the old man, who had revealed himself to be the child from the drawings. The boy who should have grown up to be a rancher, but instead had spent 40 years hiding in plain sight. Why tell me this now? Why risk exposing yourself after all these years? Michael Morrison stood slowly, his aged body protesting the movement, but his eyes burning with purpose. Because I'm dying, Mr. Robinson. The doctor in town gives me 6 months, maybe less. And because the Carver family is planning something that will destroy any chance of justice forever. What do you mean? They're not just after the silver anymore. They're planning to sell this entire area to mining companies from back east. Once that happens, they'll bring in hundreds of workers, tear up the whole mountain, and destroy every bit of evidence that my family ever existed. Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The Morrison family's secret had survived 40 years, but time was running out. If they didn't act soon, the truth would be buried forever beneath industrial progress and corporate greed. We have to get that confession, Tom said. Michael Morrison smiled for the first time since revealing his identity. I was hoping you'd say that. The aspen grove behind the cabin looked peaceful in the morning light, its white-barked trees standing like sentinels over ground that held more secrets than any cemetery should bear. Tom and Michael Morrison stood at its edge, planning what amounted to grave robbery in service of justice. 3 graves, Michael said quietly, pointing to barely visible depressions in the earth. Father dug them himself while I was getting supplies in town that last week. Said he wanted to be prepared for any eventuality. Tom studied the grove with the eye of a man who'd buried his share of the dead. The graves were positioned carefully, close enough to the cabin to be easily tended, far enough into the trees to be concealed from casual observation. John Morrison had thought of everything, even in his final days. Your father was a remarkable man, Tom said. He was also a careful man. The confession isn't just buried with Mother. It's sealed in a metal box, wrapped in oiled cloth, inside a wooden coffin that Father built himself. Even 40 years underground, it should be perfectly preserved. Scout padded between the two men, occasionally stopping to sniff at particular spots in the grove. The dog's behavior was different here. Less agitated than he'd been around the cabin, more respectful, as if he understood he was walking on sacred ground. "We'll need tools," Tom said, "and we'll need to work fast. If Patterson and his men come back—" "They won't come back until tonight," Michael interrupted. "The Carver family has always preferred to do their dirty work under cover of darkness. It's a family tradition." Tom was examining the middle grave, Susan Morrison's resting place, when Scout suddenly raised his head and looked toward the cabin. The dog's ears were pricked forward, but he wasn't showing alarm. Instead, his tail wagged once, as if recognizing someone familiar. "Someone's coming," Tom said, reaching for the rifle he'd carried from the cabin. Michael squinted toward the approaching figure. "It's all right. That's Doc Henley. I sent word for him to come out here this morning." Tom kept his rifle ready as the newcomer approached. Doc Henley proved to be a man in his 50s, carrying a black medical bag and riding a horse that had seen better years. He dismounted stiffly and nodded to both men. "Michael," he said to the old man. "Tom Robinson, I presume?" "Doctor," Tom replied cautiously. Henley looked around the grove with obvious discomfort. "I still don't like this, Michael. What you're planning is dangerous for more reasons than I can count." "It's necessary," Michael replied firmly. "You know what the Carver family has done to this community for 40 years. This is our chance to end it. By digging up your parents' graves, by risking your life and Mr. Robinson's life for evidence that might not even exist anymore." Tom studied the exchange, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "You know about Michael's real identity?" "I've been treating him for 15 years, Henley replied. "Took me a while to figure out who he really was, but when you're a doctor, you learn to see past the surface. Besides, he has his mother's eyes." Michael smiled sadly. "Doc Henley is one of 3 people in this territory who know the truth about who I am. The other 2 are dead, and I've spent 15 years wishing you'd trusted someone else with this secret," Henley said. "What you're planning today could get you killed." "I'm dying anyway," Michael replied matter-of-factly. "The consumption is moving faster than we hoped. I've got weeks, not months." Tom felt the familiar ache of watching someone else face the loss he'd experienced with his son. But there was also a growing sense of urgency. If Michael was dying, then time was even shorter than they'd realized. All the more reason to be careful, Henley insisted. "Let me contact the territorial authorities. Present the evidence you already have. Build a legal case against the Carvers." "With what evidence?" Michael asked. "Morrison's mining surveys? His maps? His personal letters? All circumstantial. The only evidence that will convict the Carver family of murder is Black Pete's confession, and that's buried 6 feet down." Henley sighed heavily and opened his medical bag. "Then at least let me examine you before you start digging. Make sure you're strong enough for this kind of physical labor." While Henley checked Michael's condition, Tom walked the perimeter of the grove, looking for the best approach to the gravesite. The ground was soft from recent rains, which would make digging easier, but it would also make their work more visible if anyone came looking. Scout followed Tom on his reconnaissance, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents. At one point, the dog began pawing at a spot near the base of a large aspen tree, whining softly as he dug. "What is it, boy?" Tom knelt and brushed away the loose soil Scout had disturbed. A few inches down, his fingers encountered something hard and metallic. Careful excavation revealed a small metal box, similar to the one they'd found in the cabin, but smaller and more carefully sealed. "Michael," Tom called. "Scout found something." The old man hurried over, followed by Doc Henley. When Michael saw the box, his face went pale. "Dear God, I'd forgotten about that. What is it?" "Father's insurance policy. He told me he'd buried something extra, something that would prove our case, even if the main confession was lost or destroyed." Tom opened the box carefully. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept them perfectly preserved, were photographs. Not family portraits, but surveillance photographs. Images of Black Pete Carver and his men in the act of committing crimes. "Your father took these?" "Father bought a camera from a traveling photographer," Michael explained. "Spent weeks documenting Pete's activities, rustling cattle, threatening homesteaders, burning out families who wouldn't sell their land. Pete never knew he was being watched. The photographs were damning evidence, clear images of recognizable men committing obvious crimes. But the most important photograph was the last one in the collection, Black Pete Carver, standing over two freshly dug graves. A shovel in his hands and blood on his clothes. This is from the night your parents were killed, Tom realized. Father set up the camera in the woods before the final confrontation. He knew he was going to die, but he made sure there would be evidence. Doc Henley examined the photographs with growing amazement. These would be enough to convict anyone involved in the crimes. But after 40 years, most of the original perpetrators are dead. But their sons aren't, Michael said grimly. And conspiracy to conceal murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. Tom studied the photograph of Black Pete at the gravesite. Something about the image bothered him, not what was in the picture, but what was missing from it. There are only 2 graves in this photograph, he said. But you said there were 3 bodies, Michael's face darkened. Because Father buried himself alive. The statement hung in the air like a physical weight. Even Scout seemed to sense the gravity of what had been revealed. What do you mean? Tom asked. Pete tortured my parents for hours, trying to get them to reveal where they'd hidden the evidence. When they refused to talk, he killed them out of frustration. But Father wasn't dead yet. He was barely alive. But he was conscious. Michael's voice grew steady. As if he'd practiced telling this story in his mind for 40 years. Pete left Father for dead and buried my parents first. While Pete and his men were celebrating, Father crawled to the 3rd grave he'd dug for himself. He still had the confession with him, the written record of everything Pete had told him. Father sealed it in the metal box and buried it with himself. He buried himself alive. Doc Henley asked in horror. Pete came back to bury Father's body, but the grave was already filled. Father had managed to cover himself with just enough soil to appear dead, but left an air pocket so he could breathe. He survived 3 days underground before he finally died. Tom felt sick, imagining the dedication and courage it would have taken for a dying man to bury himself alive to protect evidence. That might someday bring justice. How do you know all this? Because I was watching from the caves, Michael whispered. I saw everything. I saw Pete leave Father for dead, and I saw Father crawl to his own grave. I wanted to help him, but he'd made me promise to stay hidden no matter what happened. The 3 men stood in silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of John Morrison's sacrifice. Tom understood now why Michael had waited 40 years to reveal the truth. Who would believe such a story without absolute proof? The confession is in your father's grave, Tom said. Sealed in a metal box, clutched in his hands, preserved by his sacrifice. Doc Henley shook his head slowly. Even if we recover the confession, the legal battle will take years. The Carver family has money, influence, political connections. Then we don't fight them in court, Tom said quietly. We fight them the same way they've been fighting, on their own terms. Michael smiled grimly. What did you have in mind, Mr. Robinson? Tom looked at Scout, who was watching the conversation with obvious intelligence. The dog seemed to understand that important decisions were being made, decisions that would affect all their futures. We give them exactly what they want, Tom said. We let them think they've found Morrison's evidence. And then we spring the trap. The afternoon sun filtered through the aspen leaves, casting dancing shadows across the graves that held 40 years of secrets. Soon, very soon, those secrets would see daylight again, and the Carver family's long reign of terror would finally come to an end. The sun was setting behind Devil's Hollow when Tom put his plan into motion. He had spent the afternoon carefully staging the scene, using the Morrison family's hidden silver cachet as bait for a trap that would either end the Carver family's reign of terror or get them all killed. Michael Morrison sat in the cabin's main room. The recovered confession spread on the table before him like a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. The document had been exactly where he'd said it would be, clutched in his father's skeletal hands, sealed in a metal box that had protected it from 4 decades of underground decay. Black Pete Carver's confession was everything Michael had promised and more. Written in the killer's own hand, it detailed not just the Morrison murders, but a litany of crimes spanning 20 years. Rustling, claim jumping, intimidation, and murder across 3 territories. More importantly, it implicated territorial officials who had taken bribes to look the other way. "They'll come tonight," Michael said, his voice steady despite the consumption that was slowly killing him. "Patterson was here yesterday asking questions. The Carver boys know you found something." Tom checked his rifle one final time and looked toward the window. Scout was positioned there, alert and watchful, his supernatural senses extended into the gathering darkness. The dog had been restless all afternoon, sensing the approaching confrontation. "Remember the plan," Tom said. "When they come, you show them the confession. Let them read enough to understand what it means. Then I tell them there are copies hidden in 3 different locations," Michael finished. "That killing us won't solve their problem anymore." Doc Henley emerged from the back room where he'd been preparing medical supplies. "I still think this is madness. We should have taken the confession to the territorial marshal." "The territorial marshal is on the Carver payroll," Michael replied. "Always has been. Father tried to contact him 40 years ago. That's how Pete knew he was building a case." Tom understood Michael's logic, even if he didn't like the risks involved. The confession implicated too many powerful people for the normal legal system to handle. Sometimes justice required more direct methods. A horse whinnied in the distance, followed by the sound of multiple riders approaching the cabin. Scout's ears perked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The Carver family had arrived. 3 riders, Tom said, counting the distinct hoofbeats. "Maybe 4. Patterson and both Carver brothers," Michael confirmed. "Plus probably one of their hired guns." Tom moved to his position beside the fireplace, where he could cover the room's main entrance while remaining partially concealed. The plan was simple. Let the Carvers think they had the upper hand, then reveal that the evidence was beyond their reach. A heavy fist pounded on the cabin door, followed by Patterson's voice. "Robinson! We know you're in there. Time to have that conversation we discussed." Tom nodded to Michael, who rose slowly from his chair and walked to the door. The old man's movements were deliberate, unthreatening, but his eyes held 40 years of suppressed anger. "Come in," Michael called. "But come alone." The door opened, and Patterson entered, his hand resting on his pistol. Behind him came 2 other men, younger, better dressed, with the soft look of men who'd inherited their power rather than earning it. These had to be the Carver brothers. The 4th man remained outside, positioned where he could watch for trouble. Smart tactics, Tom thought. The Carvers might be criminals, but they weren't fools. "Well, well," said the taller of the Carver brothers, looking around the cabin with obvious satisfaction. "The famous Robinson cabin, scene of so many unfortunate accidents over the years." "My name is Daniel Carver," the shorter brother added. "This is my brother William. I believe you've met our associate, Mr. Patterson." Michael remained standing beside the table, the confession clearly visible in the lamplight. "Gentlemen," Daniel Carver's eyes fixed on the document immediately. "What do you have there, old man?" "Something that belongs to your family," Michael replied. "Something you've been looking for." Patterson drew his pistol and pointed it at Michael. "Careful, old-timer. We're not in the mood for games." But William Carver was already moving toward the table, drawn by the sight of the aged papers. As he read the first few lines, his face went pale. "Dear God," he whispered. "It's Grandfather Pete's confession," every word, Michael confirmed, including the part where he describes torturing my parents to death. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Daniel Carver stared at Michael with dawning recognition. "You're dead," he said. "Michael Morrison died 40 years ago. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Michael replied calmly, "though not by much. I'm dying now, so I have nothing left to lose." Patterson kept his gun trained on Michael, while the Carver brothers huddled over the confession, reading their grandfather's detailed account of his crimes. Tom could see the growing panic in their faces as they realized the document's implications. "This would destroy us," William said. "Our businesses, our political connections, everything we've built. "Which is why you're going to give it to us," Daniel added, turning back to Michael with murder in his eyes. "Right now." Michael smiled, the first genuine smile Tom had seen from him. "I'm afraid that's not possible, gentlemen." "Why not?" "Because this is just one of 4 copies." The Carver brothers exchanged glances. Patterson's gun hand trembled slightly. "You're lying," Daniel said. "Doc Henley has a copy," Michael continued conversationally. "There's another in a bank vault in Denver. And the 4th is with a federal marshal who's already en route to investigate your family's activities." Tom watched the calculation play across the Carvers' faces. Even if they killed everyone in the cabin, the evidence would still exist. Their grandfather's crimes would finally see justice, but Tom had underestimated their desperation. "Then we'll just have to make sure nobody lives to testify," Daniel Carver said, drawing his own weapon. The moment Daniel Carver drew his weapon, Scout erupted into action. The border collie launched himself across the cabin with the speed and precision of a wolf, his teeth finding Patterson's gun hand before the man could react. Patterson screamed and dropped his pistol as Scout's jaws clamped down with 40 pounds of pressure. Tom used the distraction to bring his rifle to bear on William Carver, who was fumbling for his own weapon. "Don't," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made life-and-death decisions before. But Daniel Carver was already firing, his shot splintering wood inches from Tom's head. Tom dove behind the heavy table as 2 more shots rang out, one of them punching through the cabin wall near the fireplace. Michael Morrison, despite his age and illness, moved with surprising agility. He grabbed the confession and rolled toward the back room as bullets flew around him. Doc Henley, who had been tending supplies, found himself caught in the crossfire with no cover except a wooden chair. "Scout, release!" Tom commanded, and the dog immediately let go of Patterson's mangled hand and bounded toward the relative safety of the back room. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Tom's single-shot rifle was at a disadvantage against the Carver's repeating pistols, but his position behind the heavy table provided better cover than their positions near the doorway. William Carver made the mistake of rushing Tom's position, thinking to overwhelm him with aggressive tactics. Tom's rifle shot took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the cabin floor, where he lay still, blood pooling beneath his body. Daniel Carver's response was immediate and vicious. He put 3 shots into the table, the heavy slugs punching through the wood and forcing Tom to flatten himself against the floor. Splinters rained down around him as he tried to reload his rifle with hands that shook from adrenaline. Patterson, despite his wounded hand, had retrieved his dropped pistol and was advancing on Doc Henley's position. The doctor had no weapon and no cover, and Tom realized he was about to watch another innocent man die. But Michael Morrison had other plans. The old man emerged from the back room with one of the antique weapons they'd found in the hidden cache, Spencer repeating rifle that his father had maintained in perfect condition. Despite the consumption that was killing him, despite 40 years of hiding and fear, Michael Morrison stepped into the fight with the calm determination of a man settling old debts. His first shot took Patterson in the shoulder, spinning the hired gun around and ruining his aim. His second shot shattered Patterson's gun arm at the elbow, effectively ending the man's threat. Daniel Carver turned his attention to Michael, recognizing the greater danger. "You should have stayed dead, boy," he snarled, raising his pistol. "I've been dead for 40 years, Michael replied, working the Spencer's lever action. "Tonight, I come back to life." The 2 men faced each other across the blood-spattered cabin, the last surviving Morrison and the last surviving Carver brother. For a moment, time seemed suspended as 40 years of hatred and grief crystallized into a single moment of reckoning. Daniel Carver fired first, his shot taking Michael in the chest and staggering the old man backward. But Michael's return shot was steadier, more deliberate, guided by decades of suppressed rage and the ghost of his murdered parents. Daniel Carver dropped his pistol and fell to his knees, clutching his stomach where Michael's bullet had found its mark. Blood seeped between his fingers as he looked up at the man he'd thought was long dead. "The confession?" he gasped. Give me the confession and I'll make you rich. Richer than you can imagine. Michael Morrison walked slowly across the cabin, the Spencer rifle still trained on the dying man. His own blood was spreading across his shirt, but his eyes were clear and focused. "I don't want your money," Michael said. "I want justice for my family." "They're dead," Daniel wheezed. "Has been for 40 years. What's the point now?" "The point," Michael said, kneeling beside the wounded man, "is that some debts can only be paid in blood." Daniel Carver tried to speak again, but blood filled his mouth and he collapsed onto the cabin floor beside his brother. The last of Black Pete Carver's line had finally paid for their grandfather's crimes. Tom rose from behind the bullet-riddled table, his ears ringing from the gunfire. Scout padded over to him, unhurt but alert for continuing danger. The dog had saved Tom's life with his attack on Patterson, and Tom scratched his ears gratefully. "Doc?" "Tom cold." "I'm all right," Henley replied, emerging from behind his inadequate cover. "But Michael needs help." Tom hurried to where Michael Morrison sat propped against the cabin wall, the Spencer rifle across his knees and the confession still clutched in his free hand. The old man was badly wounded, but his eyes held a peace that Tom hadn't seen before. "Is it over?" Michael asked. Tom looked around the cabin at the 3 dead men who had terrorized this territory for decades. "It's over." Michael Morrison smiled and closed his eyes. "Father can rest now." Outside, the 4th man, the one who had stayed with the horses, could be heard riding away at full gallop. He would carry word of the Carver brothers' death back to town, ending 40 years of fear and corruption. The Morrison family had finally found justice, and Tom Robinson had finally found something worth fighting for. 3 months later, Tom Robinson stood in the aspen grove behind the cabin, watching the spring sun filter through new leaves that danced in the mountain breeze. The graves beneath the trees had been properly marked now. 3 simple headstones that bore the names of John Morrison, Susan Morrison, and their son Michael, who had finally joined his parents in peace. Michael Morrison had survived the gunfight by exactly 4 days, long enough to see Black Pete Carver's confession published in territorial newspapers, long enough to watch federal marshals arrest the corrupt officials who had protected the Carver family, and long enough to transfer the property deed to Tom with a simple request: make it a home again. Scout padded through the grove, no longer the agitated, sensing animal he'd been when they first arrived. The dog had settled into the peaceful rhythm of mountain life, though he still occasionally stopped at the stone hearth where he'd first uncovered the Morrison family's secrets. Some memories, Tom reflected, were too important to forget entirely. Doc Henley emerged from the cabin carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd finally seen justice served. "The territorial governor's office sent another letter," he said, handing Tom an official envelope. "They want to interview you again about the Carver family's activities." Tom opened the letter and scanned its contents. Federal investigators had used Black Pete's confession to uncover a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. 3 judges had been removed from office, a territorial marshal had been arrested, and the Carver family's business empire had collapsed under the weight of criminal investigation. "They're offering a reward," Tom said, showing Doc Henley the letter. $5,000 for recovering the evidence that broke the case. That's a fortune. "What will you do with it?" Tom looked around the hollow that had become his home. The cabin had been repaired and expanded, with new windows that let in the mountain light and a stone foundation that would last for generations. The silver mine that John Morrison had discovered was producing a modest but steady income, enough to support a simple life without the crushing poverty that had driven Tom here in the first place. "I think I'll use it to build a school," Tom said finally. Doc Henley raised an eyebrow. "A school? Out here?" "Not out here, in town. For children whose families can't afford to send them east for education." Tom folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "Michael Morrison wanted to be a rancher when he grew up. He never got that chance, but maybe we can make sure other children do get their chances." The doctor smiled and raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To second chances," Tom was about to respond when Scout's ears perked up and the dog trotted toward the cabin, tail wagging in greeting. A moment later, Tom heard the sound of approaching horses, not the threatening approach of the Carver family, but the leisurely pace of friendly visitors. 2 riders emerged from the tree line, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and weathered hands, accompanied by a boy of perhaps 12 who sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to ranch life. They were clearly mother and son, and clearly people who belonged in this mountain country. "Mr. Robinson?" the woman called as she dismounted. "I'm Sarah Martinez. This is my son David. We heard you might be looking for help with the ranch." Tom had indeed been considering hiring help. The silver mine required attention, the expanding cabin needed maintenance, and Scout wasn't getting any younger. More importantly, the hollow felt too quiet, with just 1 man and 1 dog to fill it. "Mrs. Martinez," Tom replied, walking over to greet them. "I appreciate you coming out here, but I should warn you, this place has a complicated history." "We know about the Morrison family," she said quietly. "Everyone in the territory knows what happened here and what you did to set it right. David and I lost our own ranch to men not much different from the Carvers. We're looking for a fresh start." Tom studied the boy, who was examining Scout with obvious delight. The dog, for his part, seemed to approve of the young visitor, allowing David to scratch his ears and even wagging his tail. "Do you know anything about silver mining?" Tom asked. "My late husband worked the mines in Colorado before we tried ranching," Sarah replied. "I learned enough to manage the business side of things." "And I can help with the animals," David added eagerly. "Ma says I have a way with horses." Tom felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and loneliness that had defined his life for so long. Here was a family that needed a home, and here was a home that needed a family. "There's a small house up the creek about a 1/4 mile," he said. "John Morrison built it for hired hands. It would need some work, but it's sound." Sarah Martinez smiled, and Tom saw hope light up her eyes. "We're not afraid of work, Mr. Robinson." As the afternoon wore on, Tom found himself showing the Martinez family around the property, explaining the mining operation and the improvements he'd made to the cabin. David peppered him with questions about Scout, about the mountains, about the silver mine, and about everything else that caught his interest. That evening, as they sat around the table, sharing a meal Sarah had prepared from supplies in her saddlebags, Tom realized that the hollow was no longer the lonely, haunted place he'd discovered 6 months ago. It was becoming something he'd thought he'd lost forever, a home filled with the voices and laughter of people who cared about each other. Scout lay beside the fireplace, no longer guarding against supernatural threats, but simply enjoying the warmth of the fire and the comfort of belonging somewhere. Occasionally, the dog would lift his head and look toward the aspen grove, as if acknowledging the peaceful spirits that rested there. As Tom prepared for bed that night, he opened the drawer where he kept his most precious possession, his son's silver pocket watch. For 5 years, the watch had been a symbol of loss and guilt, a reminder of the life he'd failed to protect. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like something else, a bridge between the love he'd lost and the love he was learning to accept again. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the aspen trees, carrying away the last echoes of old sorrows and welcoming the promise of new beginnings. In Devil's Hollow, where 40 years of grief had finally found peace, Tom Robinson had discovered that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to choose to truly live. The broken mountain man had found his way home,